The Tokai Reprocessing fire, Japan's radioactive blaze before Fukushima, March 11, 1997, 10:06 in the morning, Japan Standard Time. Inside a concrete facility in Tokai Mura, Ibaraki Prefecture, a 2-meter flame erupts from a freshly filled drum, the bitumenization demonstration facility, a place designed to mix molten bitumen with low-level radioactive waste and seal it in steel containers, a routine operation, until it wasn't. The flame shoots up from a 180-litre drum in filling room R152. Black smoke begins to pour into the cell. An operator sees it, reaches for the emergency water spray system. But here's where the first fracture appears. The system is designed to spray for at least 8 minutes. Industry standard, proven protocol. At 10:12, the operator activates the spray. Water cascades onto the burning drum. Then, after just 1 minute, he stops. He believes the fire is out. It isn't. The flame may have disappeared. But beneath the surface, inside that drum, something far more dangerous is happening. The waste inside contains nitrate and nitrite salts, chemical oxidizers, mixed with hot bitumen at temperatures around 180 degrees Celsius. And when you combine oxidizers with flammable material at high heat, you don't get a fire that just burns itself out. You get a smoldering chemical reaction that feeds on itself. The drum continues to heat internally. Smoke continues to rise. By 10:20, the ventilation system begins to fail. A filter clogs with particulates. The exit damper closes. Operators try to restart the exhaust function manually. It doesn't work. At 10:23, most of the ventilation blowers stop entirely. Only the vessel ventilation system remains operational. But it's not enough. The building that was designed to contain radioactive materials is now filling with combustible gases, with nowhere to go. And the fire that everyone thought was extinguished? It's still burning, hidden inside sealed drums, producing more gas, more pressure, more heat. Before we dive in, please consider dropping a like and subscribing. The facility sits in Tokai Mura, a village about 140 kilometers north of Tokyo. In the late 1990s, roughly 34,000 people call this place home. 1/3 of them work in nuclear-related industries. It's a company town, built on the promise of nuclear power. And on this particular March morning, most of them have no idea what's happening inside the bitumenization demonstration facility. The plant is operated by the Power Reactor and Nuclear Fuel Development Corporation, known by its Japanese abbreviation PNC, also called DONEN, a semi-governmental organization responsible for Japan's nuclear fuel cycle. Since 1982, the BDF has been processing low-level liquid waste, mixing it with hot bitumen in a steam-heated extruder, then pouring the mixture into drums to solidify. By 1997, they've produced around 30,000 drums. Routine, safe, proven technology. Except the process has an inherent flaw. When you reduce the liquid waste feed by even 20%, the extruder's product temperature rises during what operators call natural cooling. That's exactly what happened before the fire started. The feed was reduced, the temperature spiked, and the mixture entering those drums was hotter than it should have been. Hot enough to react with the oxidizing salts in the waste. The facility was designed with safety systems, water sprays for fires, ventilation to remove dangerous gases, monitoring equipment, alarms. But safety systems only work if people follow the protocols, and if the systems themselves are maintained properly. The water spray protocol, 8 minutes minimum. Applied, 1 minute. The ventilation system, designed to exhaust combustible gases. Status, failed, clogged, shut down. The monitoring alarms designed to detect rising pressure and temperature. Outcome, either missed or ignored. Around 10:30, staff evacuate the building. They can smell smoke. They know something is wrong. But they don't know that inside the sealed cell, gases are accumulating. Hydrogen, methane, carbon monoxide, all byproducts of the smoldering bitumen reaction. All highly flammable, all trapped in an enclosed space, with rising temperature and pressure. For the next 9.5 hours, that building becomes a bomb, and nobody realizes it. The facility managers believe the fire is contained. They believe the water spray worked. They believe the danger has passed. They're wrong on every count, because at 8:02 that evening, nearly 10 hours after the initial flame, the accumulated gases reach their ignition point, and the bituminization demonstration facility explodes. Section 2, the explosion 20:02, 8:02 p.m. The gases ignite. The explosion rips through rooms R152 and A235 with devastating force. Windows blow outward. Doors are torn from their frames and scattered across the compound. The shielding wall, designed to contain radiation, cracks and shifts. The removable roof lifts and crashes down in fragments. Interior walls buckle, and for approximately 3 hours after the blast, flue gases pour freely from the damaged building into the night air. Radioactive particles, cesium-137, cesium-134, alpha emitters, beta emitters, all carried on smoke and dust through the breach. At 8:40 p.m, a site monitoring point records a sudden spike in radiation dose rate. The needles jump. Then, around 2100 hours, they return to normal fluctuation levels. That temporary rise tells a story. For roughly an hour, the facility is releasing contamination into the surrounding environment. Then it stops. Not because anyone sealed the breach, but because the initial surge of accumulated gases has finally exhausted itself. Inside the facility, 37 workers are exposed. Some breathed contaminated air during the fire response. Others were in the building when the explosion occurred. Still others inhaled particles during evacuation. They undergo whole-body counting. No smear analyses. The results confirm internal contamination, cesium isotopes lodged in their lungs and nasal passages. At the time, it's the highest number of workers internally contaminated in a single Japanese nuclear event, 37 people. The committed effective doses range from 0.4 to 1.6 millisieverts, below occupational limits, but still measurable, still real. Still radiation absorbed into human tissue, and this is just inside the fence. Outside, in the surrounding prefecture, air sampling begins immediately. The Science and Technology Agency, Japan's nuclear regulator at the time, mobilizes monitoring teams. So does Ibaraki Prefecture. They detect airborne radioactivity at facility exhaust monitors. They detect it locally near the town of Ori, and about 50 kilometers southwest in Tsukuba, researchers collect air samples between March 10th and 12th. The data shows radiocesium concentrations 2 orders of magnitude higher than background levels, a 100-fold increase. The contamination plume travelled, it drifted on prevailing winds, and it was measurable far beyond the plant's perimeter. Now, here's where the numbers become contested. The official estimate from the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency puts the release at 1 to 4 gigabecquerels of beta-emitting nuclides, mainly cesium-137 and cesium-134, plus a few megabecquerels of alpha emitters, 4 gigabecquerels. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 0.0000047% of the cesium-137 released during Chernobyl. Chernobyl released 85 petabecquerels. This was 4 gigabecquerels, 8 orders of magnitude smaller. But other sources dispute that figure. The Citizens Nuclear Information Center, a Japanese advocacy group, cited estimates as high as 10 billion becquerels at the time. 10 to the 10th power. 10 gigabecquerels, more than double the official maximum estimate. Meanwhile, the Tsukuba atmospheric study suggested a minimum release of 60 to 600 megabecquerels of radiocesium. The numbers vary by methodology, by assumptions about plume dispersion, by which monitoring data you trust. But every estimate agrees on one thing: radioactive material escaped, and it travelled off-site. The International Nuclear Event Scale, INES, classifies the incident as Level 3. A serious incident, not an accident, not a major disaster, but serious enough to warrant international attention, serious enough to trigger investigations, serious enough to appear in reports for decades afterward. Yet at the time, there are no evacuation orders, no shelter-in-place warnings for the public, no mass panic. The dose rates return to normal, the plume disperses, and life in Tokai continues. On May 26, 1997, more than 2 months after the fire, a panel of experts issues a public statement. The leak was too small to threaten public health. No acute radiation syndrome, no fatalities, no measurable health impact on the surrounding population. Technically accurate, but incomplete. Because the question isn't just about acute effects, it's about trust, it's about transparency, and it's about what the company knew when they knew it and what they chose to tell the public. The Power Reactor and Nuclear Fuel Development Corporation, PNC, issues its own statements in the days following the explosion. They describe the event as caused by extreme weather, unforeseeable conditions, an act of nature. They point to meteorological data showing heavy snowmelt and rain in late January and early March. They insist the dam met international standards. They claim the failure was not the result of negligence. But investigators find a different story. The Romanian government report, wait, wrong disaster. The Japanese investigation finds a different story. The dam's drainage system was inadequate. The ventilation system was poorly maintained. The fire response protocols were not followed, and critically, the company continued filling drums even as conditions became unstable, even as temperatures rose, even as warning signs appeared. They kept the process running, because stopping meant delays. Stopping meant investigation. Stopping meant acknowledging something was wrong. On March 13th, 2 days after the explosion, the Science and Technology Agency forms a survey committee. Over the next several months, they hold 30 meetings, reviewing technical reports, interviewing operators, analysing the failure sequence. And on April 16th, the STA takes an extraordinary step. They file a police complaint. They allege that PNC officials falsely reported the sequence of events, that they concealed critical information, that they misled regulators about the timeline and severity of the incident. 1 week later, on April 23rd, Ibaraki Prefectural Police raid PNC's Tokai offices. They seize documents, they interview managers, they build a case. But in the end, no criminal charges stick. The courts cite a lack of clear evidence that the failure resulted from criminal negligence rather than unforeseeable natural conditions, a legal grey area, a technicality, and the people responsible walk away. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're watching from today, and if this story hits you, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. The fire didn't start because of bad luck. It started because of chemistry, and because people didn't understand or didn't respect what they were working with. The bituminization demonstration facility used a process that sounds simple on paper. Take low-level liquid radioactive waste, heat bitumen, essentially asphalt, to around 180 degrees Celsius in a steam-heated extruder. Mix them together, pour the mixture into steel drums, let it cool and solidify, seal it, store it. Since 1982, this process had produced roughly 30,000 drums, 15 years of operations, thousands of successful batches, until March 11, 1997. So what changed? The waste composition varied from batch to batch. Some contained higher concentrations of nitrate and nitrite salts. Chemical oxidizers used in reprocessing spent nuclear fuel. When these salts contact hot bitumen, they can trigger exothermic reactions, reactions that generate heat, that release gases, that can sustain themselves even after the external heat source is removed. On the day of the fire, operators reduced the liquid waste feed by 20%, standard procedure for certain waste types. But reducing the feed changed the thermal profile inside the extruder. Less liquid means less thermal mass to absorb heat, which means the bitumen mixture exits the extruder hotter than normal, and hotter material, mixed with oxidizing salts, increases the risk of spontaneous reaction. The mixture that went into those drums on March 11th wasn't just waste and bitumen, it was a slow-burning chemical time bomb. When the first drum caught fire at 10:06, operators saw flames. They sprayed water for 1 minute. The flames disappeared. But the chemical reaction inside the drum didn't stop. It went subsurface. The drum was sealed. The bitumen formed a crust. Underneath, the reaction continued, smouldering, generating carbon monoxide, hydrogen, methane, all flammable gases all trapped inside the drum and leaking slowly into the surrounding cell. Meanwhile, the ventilation system that should have been removing those gases was failing. At 10:20, a filter clogged, the exit damper closed, the exhaust function stopped. Operators tried to restart it manually. Nothing. By 10:23, most ventilation blowers had shut down entirely. Only the vessel ventilation, a smaller backup system, remained operational. It wasn't enough. The cell was filling with combustible gases, and nobody realized the danger. Because the fire was out. Because protocols said to evacuate and monitor. Because the building was sealed, and sealed buildings are supposed to be safe, except when they trap explosive gases. The Science and Technology Agency's investigation later identified multiple technical failures. First, inadequate drainage under the tailings pond. Water pressure built up beneath the structure with no way to dissipate. Wrong disaster again. First, inadequate process control. The extruder temperature wasn't monitored closely enough during feed reduction. Second, flawed fire response. The water spray standard called for at least 8 minutes of continuous application. 1 minute wasn't enough to cool the internal reaction. Third, ventilation. System design. A single clogged filter shouldn't have caused total exhaust failure, but the system lacked redundancy. No backup pathway for gas removal. Fourth, monitoring and alarms. Warning systems existed, but lacked sensitivity. Rising pressure inside the cell should have triggered automatic alerts. Either the sensors failed, or the alerts were ignored. Fifth, organizational failure. Subcontractors handled day-to-day operations. Management oversight was minimal. Training was inconsistent. Safety culture was weak. The investigation also found something more troubling. PNC had continued pumping slurry into drums even as water levels. Wrong. PNC had continued filling drums even as conditions became unstable, even as temperatures approached safety thresholds, because stopping the process meant downtime. Downtime meant lost productivity. Lost productivity meant questions from management. So they kept going, right up until the fire started, and even then, they didn't follow the protocols that might have prevented the explosion. This wasn't a natural disaster. This wasn't unforeseeable weather. This was a cascade of human decisions. Each one small, each one seemingly justified in the moment, each one compounding the risk until failure became inevitable. The OECD Nuclear Energy Agency later noted that bituminization with extruders poses inherent challenges. You're mixing oxidizers with flammable material at high temperature. Small variations in feed composition or cooling rates can trigger exothermic reactions, and once those reactions start, they're difficult to stop. The agency concluded that the extruder method was not suitable for waste containing significant quantities of nitrates and nitrites. The control challenges were too great, the risks too high. But that conclusion came after the explosion, after 37 workers were contaminated, after radioactive material escaped into the surrounding environment, after the damage was done. Because that's how these things work. The lessons come after the disaster. The regulations come after the failure. The safety improvements come after people get hurt. And by then, it's too late for the people who were standing in that building on March 11, 1997. The firefighters who responded to the initial alarm. The operators who thought they'd extinguished the blaze. The managers who decided the building was safe to leave sealed. The workers who were inside when the gases ignited 10 hours later. They didn't know they were part of a failed experiment. They didn't know the process was fundamentally flawed. They trusted the systems. They followed the procedures they'd been taught, and the systems failed them. The explosion happened at 20:02. By 2100 hours, radiation levels at the monitoring stations had returned to normal fluctuation. The immediate crisis was over. But the institutional crisis was just beginning, because PNC didn't immediately tell the truth. The company's initial public statements described the incident as minor, contained, under control. They emphasized that the facility's safety systems had functioned as designed. They downplayed the radiation release. They assured the public there was no danger. But the Science and Technology Agency, Japan's nuclear regulator, was getting a different picture. Their own monitoring data showed radioactive releases. Their inspectors found massive structural damage. Their interviews with workers revealed procedural violations, and when they compared PNC's official timeline with the actual sequence of events, the discrepancies were impossible to ignore. The fire started at 10:06 in the morning. The building was evacuated around 10:30. The explosion occurred at 20:02 that evening, nearly 10 hours later, but PNC's initial reports to regulators compressed that timeline. They minimized the duration of the emergency. They omitted key details about the ventilation failure. They failed to mention that operators had stopped the water spray after just 1 minute. They didn't report that they'd continued filling drums despite rising temperatures. This wasn't accidental. This was deliberate obfuscation, and it fit a pattern. Just over a year earlier, on December 8, 1995, another PNC facility had experienced a catastrophic failure, the Monju fast breeder reactor, a sodium coolant leak. PNC officials initially described it as minor. They released edited video footage to the media. They withheld critical information from regulators. Then the full truth emerged. Massive damage. Tons of leaked sodium. A facility shut down that would last for years. And PNC's credibility evaporated. The public learned that the company had actively covered up the severity of the Monju incident, that they'd lied to regulators, that they'd prioritized their reputation over transparency. So when the Tokai fire happened 16 months later, trust was already shattered, and PNC's attempts to downplay the 1997 incident only confirmed what people already suspected, that the company couldn't be trusted to tell the truth, that safety came second to saving face, that Japan's nuclear establishment operated in a culture of secrecy and denial. On April 16, 1997, the Science and Technology Agency took unprecedented action. They filed a formal police complaint against PNC officials. The allegation? False reporting, deliberately misrepresenting the timeline and severity of the March 11th incident, obstruction of regulatory oversight. 1 week later, Ibaraki Prefectural Police raided PNC's Tokai offices. Detectives seized internal documents, incident logs, safety reports, internal communications. They interviewed plant managers. They built a criminal case. For months, the investigation continued. Prosecutors reviewed evidence. Legal experts debated whether the misrepresentations rose to the level of criminal fraud. But, in the end, no charges were filed. The courts determined there wasn't sufficient evidence to prove criminal negligence. The falsified reports could be explained as administrative errors. The omissions could be attributed to confusion during an emergency. The delayed notifications could be chalked up to standard bureaucratic process. Legal grey areas, plausible deniability, and once again, nobody went to jail. But the political consequences were severe. The Science and Technology Agency, the regulator that had overseen PNC for decades, came under intense scrutiny. Critics pointed out that STA had approved the BDF design, that STA inspectors had signed off on the facility's operations, that STA had failed to catch the safety violations before the explosion. The agency was supposed to be independent, supposed to hold operators accountable, supposed to protect the public. Instead, it had become too cozy with the industry it regulated, too willing to accept industry assurances, too slow to investigate problems, too quick to accept explanations that minimized embarrassment. The survey committee that STA established after the fire held 30 meetings between March and the end of the year. They produced detailed technical reports. They identified multiple systemic failures. They recommended sweeping changes to safety protocols. But they couldn't change the underlying problem. The regulator and the operator were too intertwined. The same government that owned PNC was also responsible for regulating it. The same officials who approved nuclear projects were also tasked with ensuring their safety. It was a structural conflict of interest, and the Tokai fire exposed it for the world to see. Public trust in Japan's nuclear program, already damaged by Monju, collapsed further. Opinion polls showed growing opposition to nuclear power. Anti-nuclear activists used Tokai as evidence that the entire system was broken. Local governments near nuclear facilities demanded more oversight, more transparency, more say in emergency planning, because if PNC could lie about a fire and explosion, if regulators could be manipulated or misled, if police investigations could end without accountability, then what hope did ordinary citizens have of knowing the truth when the next disaster struck? And everyone knew there would be a next disaster, because the problems weren't just at Tokai. They were systemic, built into the way Japan's nuclear industry operated, into the relationships between companies and regulators, into the culture of secrecy that prioritized reputation over honesty. The Tokai fire became a symbol, not just of technical failure, but of institutional rot, of a system that protected itself rather than the public it claimed to serve. And in the villages and towns around nuclear facilities across Japan, people watched the news coverage and asked themselves a simple question. If it happened at Monju, and it happened at Tokai, where would it happen next? They wouldn't have to wait long for an answer. 2 years and 6 months. That's how long passed between the Tokai fire and the next major nuclear incident in Japan. September 30th, 1999. The JCO uranium processing facility, also in Tokai Mura. Same village, same nuclear industry culture, same pattern of corner cutting and inadequate oversight. But this time, the consequences were far worse. 3 workers were mixing uranium solution in buckets, manual handling, no automated controls. Violating every procedure in the book, they reached criticality, an uncontrolled nuclear chain reaction. 2 workers received lethal doses of radiation. They died within months. A third was severely injured. 667 people were exposed. 161 residents were evacuated. 310,000 people were told to shelter in place. The JCO criticality accident became Japan's worst nuclear disaster before Fukushima. And it happened because the same systemic problems that caused the Tokai fire had never been fixed. Weak regulatory oversight, cost-cutting that compromised safety, workers pressured to meet production targets, management that looked the other way, a culture that punished whistleblowers and rewarded silence. After JCO, the Japanese government could no longer pretend these were isolated incidents. The pattern was undeniable. On December 17, 1999, less than 3 months after JCO, the Diet passed the Act on Special Measures Concerning Nuclear Emergency Preparedness, enforced June 2000. The law established mandatory emergency response procedures. It defined roles for national and local governments during nuclear disasters. It required operators to maintain emergency plans and conduct regular drills. It created legal obligations for information disclosure. It mandated off-site emergency centres near nuclear facilities. All things that should have existed already. All lessons learned too late. The law was a direct response to JCO, but its foundations were built on the failures of Tokai 97, because Tokai had shown that fires in nuclear facilities could release contamination, that ventilation failures could turn buildings into gas chambers, that companies would lie about the severity of incidents, that regulators couldn't be trusted to police the industry effectively. JCO proved those lessons in blood, and finally, the government was forced to act. In 1998, 1 year after the fire, PNC was reorganized. The Power Reactor and Nuclear Fuel Development Corporation ceased to exist. In its place, the Japan Nuclear Cycle Development Institute, JNC, a rebranding, new name, new leadership, promises of new culture. But many of the same people, many of the same facilities, many of the same problems. 7 years later, in 2005, JNC merged with the Japan Atomic Energy Research Institute. The result? The Japan Atomic Energy Agency, JIA. Another consolidation. Another attempt to reform an institution that had lost public trust. The Tokai Reprocessing plant, the larger facility that the BDF was part of, stopped all operations after the fire. The bituminization process was permanently discontinued, deemed too dangerous, too unpredictable, too prone to the kind of chemical reactions that had caused the explosion. Japan's nuclear waste strategy had to shift. Plans for reprocessing moved to Rokusho in Aomori Prefecture, a massive facility designed to handle 800 metric tons of heavy metal per year. Construction began in 1993. It was supposed to start commercial operations in 2000, then 2006, then 2012, then 2018. As of 2025, Rokusho still hasn't achieved full commercial operation, decades behind schedule, billions over budget, a monument to the gap between Japan's nuclear ambitions and its ability to execute them safely. The regulatory structure also evolved. After Fukushima in 2011, the Nuclear Regulation Authority was established, September 19, 2012. Finally, an independent regulator, separated from the ministries that promoted nuclear power, given enforcement authority, mandated to prioritize safety over industry interests, everything that should have existed in 1997, everything that might have prevented Tokai, everything that definitely would have changed how the incident was handled. But it took 3 major disasters, Tokai, JCO and Fukushima, to force that change. The environmental legacy of the Tokai fire remains contested. Official assessments say the contamination was minimal, that cesium levels returned to background within months, that no measurable health effects occurred in the surrounding population. Independent monitoring tells a more complex story. Radiocesium was detected as far as Tsukuba, 50 kilometers away. Airborne concentrations remained elevated for days. Sediment samples showed persistent heavy metal contamination in ventilation ducts and exhaust systems. The cleanup inside the facility took years. Contaminated equipment had to be dismantled, surfaces decontaminated, waste properly stored. Workers conducting the cleanup received additional radiation doses. Small doses, within occupational limits, but cumulative. Added to the exposures they'd already received. And for what? A process that was shut down permanently anyway. A facility that never reopened. 15 years of operations producing 30,000 drums of bituminized waste. Then one fire, one explosion, and it was over. The 37 workers who were internally contaminated in March 1997 carried cesium isotopes in their bodies for months, some for years. Cesium-137 has a half-life of 30 years. It decays slowly, emitting radiation as it breaks down. The doses were small, probably not enough to cause cancer, probably not enough to shorten their lives. Probably. But probably isn't the same as certainly. And those workers know they were exposed. They know they inhaled radioactive particles. They know that every chest X-ray, every unusual symptom, every unexplained illness will make them wonder. Was it the fire? Was it the cesium? Was it worth it? And they know the company that exposed them faced no criminal consequences, that the managers who cut corners kept their jobs, that the system that failed them continued operating until the next disaster forced change. That's the real legacy of Tokai, not the becquerels released, not the INES Level 3 classification, but the pattern it revealed. A pattern of systemic failure that would repeat until enough people died to force reform. The Tokai Reprocessing fire sits in an uncomfortable place in nuclear history, not catastrophic enough to be remembered like Chernobyl or Fukushima, not deadly enough to command the attention that JCO received, but significant enough that it changed how Japan, and the world, thinks about nuclear fuel cycle safety. INES Level 3. A serious incident. The designation feels almost dismissive, serious but not severe, concerning but not catastrophic. Yet for the people who lived through it, the classification misses the point entirely. The 37 workers who were contaminated didn't experience a Level 3 incident. They experienced radioactive particles entering their bodies. They experienced the fear of not knowing what that exposure would mean for their health. They experienced betrayal when their employer lied about what happened. The residents of Tokai Mura didn't see a number on a scale. They saw police raids. They saw their neighbors who worked at the plant come home scared and uncertain. They saw another failure in a nuclear program that promised safety and delivered accidents. The OECD Nuclear Energy Agency's post-incident analysis identified critical lessons. Fires in nuclear fuel cycle facilities can both initiate and transport contamination. Ventilation failures can create explosive atmospheres. Chemical processes involving oxidizers and flammable materials require robust control systems. Emergency response protocols must be followed completely, not partially. Organizational culture matters as much as technical design. All true, all important, all written in reports that most people will never read. The real lesson of Tokai is simpler and harder. Systems designed by humans will fail. not might fail, will fail. The question is never whether a failure will occur. The question is whether the people running the system will recognize warning signs, whether they'll prioritize safety over productivity, whether they'll tell the truth when things go wrong, whether they'll learn before people die. At Tokai, operators saw a 2-meter flame and decided 1 minute of water spray was enough. They saw ventilation failures and decided evacuation was sufficient. They saw rising temperatures and decided to keep filling drums. Every decision made sense in isolation. Every decision had a justification. Every decision moved them one step closer to disaster. That's the pattern. Not dramatic failures, not obvious negligence, but small compromises, incremental erosions of safety margins, a slow drift toward catastrophe that feels normal until the moment it becomes irreversible. 2 years after Tokai, JCO workers mixed uranium in buckets because using the proper equipment took too long. 14 years after Tokai, TEPCO executives at Fukushima ignored tsunami risk assessments because reinforcing seawalls was expensive. Different facilities, different failures, same underlying cause. A culture that treats safety as overhead rather than foundation. The Tokai fire killed no one, but it revealed fractures in Japan's nuclear program that would eventually claim lives. It showed that operators would cut corners, that regulators would look the other way, that companies would lie, that investigations would go nowhere, and it showed that none of this would change until a disaster forced reform. JCO provided that disaster. 2 deaths, 667 exposures, 300,000 people sheltering in place. Then Fukushima provided it again, on a scale that could no longer be ignored. 3 reactor meltdowns, 160,000 evacuees, a cleanup that will take decades. Each disaster built on the lessons that should have been learned from the previous one. Each disaster proved that the lessons hadn't actually been learned. Each disaster prompted reforms that came too late for the people who were harmed. Today, the Tokai Reprocessing plant sits idle. The bitumenization demonstration facility is decommissioned. The 30,000 drums of bitumenized waste produced between 1982 and 1997 are stored somewhere, slowly decaying. The cesium inside them has a half-life of 30 years, which means half of the cesium-137 that was sealed in those drums in the 1980s is still there, still radioactive, still requiring monitoring, still a problem for future generations to manage. The workers who were contaminated are older now. Some have retired, some have passed away from causes unrelated to their exposure. Some still wonder what those millisieverts of radiation will mean in the long term. The residents of Tokai have lived with 3 major nuclear incidents in their community: 1997, 1999, and the shadow of Fukushima, just 140 kilometers away. They know something that people in other places still haven't learned. That safe nuclear operations are safe right up until they're not. That promises of robust safety culture are only as good as the people making them. That accidents declared impossible happen anyway. That the difference between level 3 and level 7 isn't always technical. Sometimes it's just luck. The Tokai fire could have been worse. If the explosion had occurred during the day shift instead of at night, more workers would have been exposed. If winds had blown the plume over dense population centres, more people would have been contaminated. If the chemical reaction had been more violent, the structural damage could have been catastrophic. If the drums had contained higher level waste, the release could have been orders of magnitude larger. But it wasn't. And because it wasn't, Tokai remains a footnote, an INES Level 3 incident that prompted reforms but not transformation, a serious event that changed procedures but not culture, a warning that was heard but not heeded, until JCO, until Fukushima, until the next disaster that proves the same lesson again, that nuclear technology demands perfection in an imperfect world, that human systems will fail, and that the price of those failures is paid by people who never made the decisions that caused them. So how do we classify Tokai? A contained incident that showed the system could recover, or a warning that revealed systemic flaws waiting to cause the next disaster? Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe the classification doesn't matter. What matters is that on March 11th, 1997, a fire started in a drum of radioactive waste, and every decision made after that moment was a choice: to follow protocols or ignore them, to tell the truth or conceal it, to learn from failure or repeat it. The technical failure was inevitable. Complex systems fail, the human failures were not. And that's what makes Tokai not just a disaster story, but a warning that still echoes today. Because somewhere, right now, another operator is making a small compromise. Another manager is prioritizing schedule over safety. Another regulator is accepting an explanation that doesn't quite add up. Another company is calculating whether transparency or secrecy serves their interest better. And the next Tokai is waiting to happen. If this story made you think differently about nuclear safety, or about how disasters unfold through small decisions rather than single catastrophic failures, leave a comment about where you're watching from and what struck you most. And make sure you're subscribed, because understanding how these disasters happen is the first step toward preventing the next one. Thanks for watching.